Welcome to today's USP and Pharmatech webinar, PCM, What is the Best Business Strategy? Thank you for taking time out of your busy schedules to join us. Next slide. Presenting today is Mr. Lawrence de Belder, PCM Practice Lead, Pharmatech Associates. Welcome and thank you. I will now hand the presentation over to Mr. de Belder.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for attending this webinar, where we'll give you some insight in what makes a business case in continuous manufacturing for oral solid dose drug product, and what is the best business strategy under different circumstances. But before we move into that, I would like to assure that we are all on the same wavelength, and I would like to first explain to you how a solid dose batch process typically is executed, so you have a better reference to understand how a continuous process works. Now, since the beginning of the automatic production of tablets, there have been many. It has always been made in a compression machine, which by itself is already a continuous machine. But until recently, the preparation of the ingredients of tablets has always been done for defined materials of defined amounts of material. And first, there was always separately weighing of the material in containers, then staging them somewhere, bringing it into a V blender or a bin blender. Then they were sampled, then released, stored again until the compression area was free, and then compressed until a certain amount was finished. So we get a defined batch quantity. And so we call that direct compression. Now, in some circumstances, the formulation does not mix well or flow well. In that case, an additional step is added, which often is dry granulation. That's two cylindrical rolls that press the formulation together so that a ribbon rolls out that is broken into flakes. And those flakes are milled so that we get a certain particle size distribution, which are granules. And these are then stored in a warehouse again. Afterwards, they are blended, go again in a warehouse, and then they go to the compression machine. Now, in some cases, that's not enough, and there's also compression issues with that granulation mixture. So in that case, a wet granulation process is added instead of the dry granulation in the batch world. And so there again, the material is dispensed or weighed, goes to the warehouse again. A solution is made, a binding solution that is then sprayed on top of a fluidized amount of this powder mixture. And because of that movement and the fluidization and the binder solution that is sprayed on top, granules are being formed that then afterwards are being dried, and that mixture then is a lot easier to manage in a compression process. Now, very often it's still blended then, and then there's a number of additional elements added in there, like a lubricant, to be able to release more easy the tablets out of the die in the compression step, and then it goes to the compression machine. In most cases, after compression, there's still a coating step, and the coated tablets are then stored. Now, after all of these steps, there is a batch record being written. There is samples taken. Those samples, they go to the lab. They are analyzed. And then the material is released for the next step, which all takes very long time. So every step needs to be released, and the total amount of time for all of those steps together is the total cycle time of this production. Now, that takes a lot of time, has quite a lot of people involved, quite a lot of movement involved. There is storage involved. There's many rooms where all of this needs to happen. There is a potential for human error in the production process and in those batch records. And there is a lot of lab work involved, many QA people, a lot of QC people, long cycle times. And there's also the measurement of the quality that is being done, taking those samples, and especially at the end of the batch, samples are taken for the release of that batch. And only at the end of the batch, you will know then if the total batch was fine or not. So quality is measured afterwards, after this process, which makes it all a cumbersome undertaking, and the potential of having to throw away the batch if the release results are not according to the specifications that are needed. Now, this is during the commercial production, but also during the development. You typically start development in small equipment, making small batches, and then afterwards you need to scale up this process to larger equipment to be able to run that in a commercial scale. Now, that scale up by itself is also complicated, expensive, and you need to prove with many experiments that the material that you make in your commercial process is equivalent to the material that you made in your development process. We call that the technology transfer, and that typically is very cumbersome, slow, and expensive as well. And a lot of material is needed as well for the development as for the tech transfer. For the development, you need a lot of material because you need to do many experiments. We call that design of experiments, to show that all the parameter settings that you have identified as the optimum ones, that they are very relevant. But for every set of parameters, you need to make an additional batch or a new batch. And that makes it a slow and expensive process in development as well. Now, that's how the batch process works. Now, just imagine that we would be able to connect all of these machines and all of these process steps together into one overall production machine that can do it all with one line. Now, you can do that with a direct compression process as well, as we see on this slide on the right, where you only have a feeding step, which replaces the manual weighing, a blending step, and then the compression machine. But you can connect everything to each other. That's a possibility. You can also do that with dry granulation or even wet granulation, where you connect all these steps together, and then you feed in your material on one end. And with automatic loss in weight feeders or with feeding machines, the material would be added to the system, and all those production steps would be happening in parallel and at the same time, with at the end of the line the compression machine or even coating machines, so that you have your final product at the end. So continuously feeding material in and continuously taking final product out of the line would be the result. Now, as a consequence, you need to measure all the time in your process what is the quality of your process, and what is, for instance, the homogeneity of your mix in there. You work with blenders, so you need to constantly measure if those blends are homogeneous. Now, because you have to measure all the time, you will know at every point in time and on all the different locations on the line what the quality is of your mixture, and if everything is fine. So you measure in your system instead of at the end after your batch. So you have integrated quality by design and integrated measurement of your quality. And this gives you a very good insight in your process. You get a great process knowledge like that. Also, you have a continuous process, and because of that, you run in steady state all the time. So constantly, all the time, the same speed, the same parameters, and there's a lot less variation compared to where you have a ramping up and a ramping down with all the different processes in a batch process. So overall, you will have a better grip on the quality in your process if you run it in a continuous line. Now, you can also do this with less people, in a shorter time, because everything runs in one go with only a few people in one room, and also on a smaller footprint, on a smaller space, because everything is connected to each other. You don't need to do that all in different rooms. That brings the cost down, and also the reliability of your process will go up. You have less space needed for the machine, but also you do not have all those measurements that you need to do between all the processes. So you have no work in process standing around either, and you have shorter cycle times because of that, and also less losses because your machines are smaller, more confined, and there is lower risk on waste in between those different steps. Also, if you identify that something is out of specification, you can only reject that small portion, which limits the amount of reject overall that you will have, because you will never have a full batch that will be rejected because of that. Right? In the batch world, remember, if you take after the batch samples, identify that there is out of specifications, you need to discard the complete batch. In a continuous process, you can limit that to a small amount that is identified as out of specification. Also, during development, it has the advantage that if you run continuously, that you can do your design of experiments on the fly. So you're running your line, and instead of having to make separate batches for each set of parameter settings, you can just change those parameter settings while you are running, and X amount of minutes later, your adapted process output will come out of your line, and you can take samples of that without even having to stop. And like that, you can do many design of experiments in one go, which reduces your time for development significantly. You can also make, because of that, with less API, more experiments, which you can choose. Either you use less API for the same results, or you can get better results with the same API that you used in the past. So if you can do more experiments, you can get to a better, a stronger or robuster process. And there is higher chance even that you can do many experiments to try to develop your process so that it becomes a direct compression and you do not need to go to wet granulation because to solve your issues, which is easier in the commercial manufacturing. So all of those many high-level advantages, that's for the drug product. But now, not only for drug product manufacturing, there is continuous manufacturing possible. You could also do that for the creation of your active product. So your API process also can be done in continuous. And even in some companies, what is done is that those two are connected to each other. So making API and immediately after in one continuous flow, make drug product with that. That is possible and also reduces cycle time overall significantly and has a number of advantages. Now, those advantages here, I'm not going to read them to you again. I explained them overall. Here they are summarized on one slide, but there's a few additional ones there for the production of API. And that is that with the continuous API, you can also improve your process safety because you can do your processing on a smaller space in smaller, more confined equipment, which makes it easier to work with high pressures, with high temperatures. And also, if you run a continuous process with less ramping up and ramping down, it is more easy to achieve better yields for some specific chemical routes. And it is even possible to run some chemical routes that in a continuous process that are very difficult to achieve in a batch process. So you can have additional possibilities for chemical routing if you do continuous manufacturing. Also, potential lower use of analytical testing is possible. In the batch world, you need to take a lot of samples and you measure them with HPLCs what your concentration, etc. is. And in a continuous process, you have PAT tools that do constant measurements, which reduces your lab work. And that is valid for drug product and for API continuous manufacturing. Now back to drug product only. Now, if we look at all those benefits, there are many, many benefits, but all of those benefits, they also have assumptions behind them. So you cannot just assume that all those benefits, they are fantastic. We're going to grab them all, just do it, and automatically we'll have the benefits. That's not really the case. Some cases, you really need to understand the assumptions very well to be able to reap the benefits there. One of the big benefits of continuous manufacturing for drug product is if you have a shorter timeline for your development, well, you are theoretically able to be faster on the market. So speed to market can be improved, which could be an enormous profit margin generator for an innovator company if they're able to reduce their development time with half a year, for instance. That means that they have half a year longer that they can be on the market without that their patent expires, which gives them a lot more sales over the life cycle of a product, which can be an enormous amount. Now, that is theoretically possible, but the watch out is there that it's a new technology. So you need to understand very well what you're doing. If not, you can lose time and there is a risk for delays. Also, equipment can be delivered too late, for instance, or later than your timeline allows, which gives you delays in your overall timeline. So if you go for speed to market, timeline needs to be managed very, very well. Also, if you think you can do shorter DOEs and have less effort needed to do your development. That's true, but if you have to integrate PAT, so the automatic tools to do your sampling and to measure in line, and you're not very acquainted with this, it can take you a lot of effort to build that knowledge up and to build those models to take those samples and analyze those samples in line. And so that might be additional effort, but over time you will catch that up. And then also you can think I can do shorter DOEs, and because of that, I will need less API. That's true, but the PAT development by itself also needs API. So it's not only about the design of experiments. It's also the additional need potentially for the models that you have to build. And it depends also a little bit on when do you step into continuous manufacturing, because typically in a development process, you start with batch experiments until you reach a certain point, and then you switch over to continuous manufacturing development. If you are too far advanced, you will have to redo a number of your experiments that you did in batch into continuous, and that overlap needs this additional API then. So if you do not know exactly where to switch over, that might cost extra material in the beginning. But also there, you can have a learning curve, and you learn better and better when the cutoff point ideally is. You can also think if we make a more robust formulation, or we want to bring more formulations into direct compression instead of wet granulation, that's all very valid, but that will cost additional API as well, and that will be at the cost of your API savings then. So that's about development benefits. Now in tech transfer, if you want to do a technology transfer from your R&D to commercial manufacturing, you can benefit greatly if you have identical equipment in your R&D area and in your commercial area, because like that, you will be able to do a tech transfer from one type of equipment to the other type of equipment with nearly no change. And the nice thing is with the continuous manufacturing, you can just run your batch size longer. If you run longer, you have a bigger batch. If you run shorter time, you have a smaller batch. So in R&D, you can run short batches for your experiments. In commercial, you can use exactly the same machine and run longer batches, bigger batches for your commercial production. And so that's an enormous benefit, because like that, your tech transfer costs nearly no effort and nearly no API. You just need to show that indeed what you assumed, that the equipment on one side of the equation is exactly the same as on the other side of the equation, is indeed valid. And so you do not need to redo all those experiments to show that the different parameter settings give the same results. Now, that's all valid, but in reality, there's always some small differences. For example, you have in one building a continuous manufacturing line that fits in 3 floors, but the floor height can be slightly different in your commercial manufacturing. Although that you would have exactly the same equipment, maybe there is a different drop pipe, for instance, right before you enter your compression machine. Well, that might make a difference, because your models will vary. Your pressure that is on top of your column of powder before it enters your compression machine might be longer or shorter, and there might be a segregation risk because your pipe is longer, etc. So small changes in layout of the facility might have impact on your overall differences in your process as well. So they need to be evaluated very carefully and described very well in your regulatory filing. Now, purely in the commercial production, there you have, of course, the biggest benefit being that you have a lot more insight in your in the quality and in your process itself. So your process understanding is higher. The quality overall is better. You have a stronger process robustness, and because of that, you will be able to manage. Issues and problems in the future, quality issues a lot better because you have a lot more data as well that comes out. Your process and understanding is better, but the downside is that you will generate enormous amounts of data as well. So you will need to learn to manage this data, and not only the data itself, but also under which circumstances this data is generated, and everything needs to be stored and retrieved in a very easy manner. The operations effort is lower. You need less people for the same output, but well, you have to be a little bit careful if you compare this project with a batch project where or a batch product where it is already very lean. I can imagine in some parts of the world, for instance, your batch processes are done with people with who have who work at relatively low cost, and the process itself is leaned out completely. So that means if you change that to a continuous process, in that area there will not be a lot of benefits to find. And then if your investments are high on that end, you will not make a very good business case. Now, in your material, you will have a better yield, you will have less waste, but you need to compare that with something. So if you build a business case, what is your reference in the batch? You need to understand your batch yield. And if you design a continuous manufacturing process from scratch, what will be your reference then? If you want to show, well, my yield will be better than if I would do it in batch, you need to show what the yield in batch would have been, and you need to estimate the yield, how it will be in a continuous process, to be able to bring that into your business case. So that's not always so easy. Those references and those estimations need to be made in a large group, and everybody needs to agree up front before you're able to put them into your business case. You use less energy and less water in your process for continuous manufacturing because you are having a smaller equipment. You don't have materials standing in bins all the time as work in process, so you don't need to wash those bins, etc. But very often in a continuous process, you add cleaning in place to be able to reduce the amount of effort for washing of the parts. And that cleaning in place, that can also cost some water, so that eats your profit margin that you would have on lower water consumption, and even costs energy as well to heat up that water. You would also think, oh, that's great. If we have shorter cycle times, we will be able to lower our safety stock and have less inventory. True, but it depends a little bit on the calculation, how inventory is calculated. In some companies, inventory is calculated not only based on cycle time, but also on batch size. And in continuous manufacturing, typically the batch sizes are a lot bigger. So at the end, that might even end up with bigger inventory needed than smaller, depending on the way that it's calculated. You also will be able to reduce lab effort, indeed, because you will be able to measure a lot of the things that you typically measure. You can measure them in line. You can even go to real-time release for a big part of the CQAs that you are measuring normally. But also need to keep in mind that it's never completely gone. You always need to have conventional methods as a reference, or you might want to have conventional methods, HPLC, as a backup, for instance, if a PAT tool is not working. So don't think that they will be completely gone. It will always be there to some extent. So you will reduce your lab effort, but will not be able to eliminate it. And then you get a better supply chain flexibility, absolutely. But you will be able to have shorter cycle times, which is helpful. You also be able to create flexible batch sizes. You can, for instance, file a batch size between 20 kilos and 2000 kilos, very possible, or defined by runtime or by other things, but make it flexible. But keep in mind that it's flexible to the extent that you have to define it still at the beginning of your run. You cannot decide during your run how big your batch size will be. At the beginning of your run, you need to say, okay, with this run, I will run like 1000 kilos, and that's what you need to aim for as well. If you are too far off that, you will need to open an investigation to show what was wrong. Now, if you implement continuous manufacturing in your facility, there is many ways to do that, and because there's so many ways, you will need to make a number of important choices from the beginning. First choice will be, will I do continuous manufacturing internally, or will I work with an external party? For development, you can work with universities or others. You can work with CDMOs. So there's different ways to do this, but it's not necessarily obliged to start completely internally with your continuous manufacturing journey. You also have to choose, am I going to focus on one or two products, or am I going to build a platform that is going to be able to run many products that I'm doing? So maybe try to do them all, like Johnson & Johnson or Lilly or many other big pharma companies are having as a strategy. You can also do a pre-blend instead of working with inline feeding of all the individual components. That makes it slightly easier for products that are difficult flowing or that are not easy to mix. You also want to be able to understand the scope that you are going to use. Are you going to introduce coating or not? Are you going only for direct compression, or also wet granulation and dry granulation included or not? You need early on to understand which collaboration partners you will work with, maybe CDMOs, maybe consultants, maybe universities, maybe technology centers that will help you to climb up that learning curve, which is very important. Also, to which extent are you going to implement PAT, and for what are you going to use your modeling? You need to have a good idea of your control strategy, real-time release planning, and how what your sampling plan is going to be relatively early, because they will help. They will be needed input to define your business case. So a good idea already of all of that is needed before you can calculate in detail what the benefits will be. And also, you need to have a good idea already when to talk to the health authorities, because it is a learning of many companies that it was very important to start communicating early. And before you start with talking with the health authorities, you need to have an idea already what you are going to do. So all of that comes together at a certain moment and would be good input into your overall business case. Now, what has the biggest impact on your business case now? Well, that's twofold. You have a big impact on the cost side and big impact on the profit side. On the cost side, well, the equipment is the biggest cost probably of your project at first sight. So a low cost line will help you, but not only the line, also the design. If it's a vertical stack up or a horizontal design, might be very, very impactful. We've seen quite a few examples in the industry where vertical large lines were installed, and because of that, big adaptations to the facilities needed to be made, what made the project extremely expensive. So horizontal designs might have an advantage over vertical designs, might be a lot less costful, but you need to keep in mind that that would also mean that there will be a pneumatical transfer of the materials, and not all the products are able to do that. And so there's always a potential risk for segregation, etc., that needs to be assessed very well. Simplicity is something that will impact a lot. So if you start very complex you will have a lot of financial consequences in the long run as well. So if you can go simpler in the beginning with the possibility to extend or expand later on, that's always a lot better for your cost profile. Also start from known technology. If you do not know the technology very well, or if it's not very mature yet, it might end up with a bigger cost picture than you thought of in the beginning. And start very early to learn, and start easy as well with not too complicated aspects. Start easy, start early, and then build up your knowledge and work together with other centers and other groups that have knowledge to bring that in internally in your facility. Think very much in advance. So what we have seen in the industry in the past already, that is that one or two products were selected and everything was focused on those, and then afterwards those products, they fail in clinical trials or in different manners, and then the equipment needs to be adapted to be able to fit for next products. But that typically was expensive, and that made next projects very, very difficult. So think in advance what potentially can happen, and what are the potential alternative products that might appear in on your line or in your project, so that you are able to be flexible and to run it with under different circumstances if things happen. Now, to maximize your profit, you might want to aim for time to market. That's the biggest benefit. But also, as I explained before, you might have a risk for delays. So make sure that you achieve the timeline that you aim for. Include tech transfer if you can in your overall project. Have the same line in R&D and commercial, because that's a big money maker as well. You might potentially save bioequivalency tests that you need to do, etc. On top of a lot of tech transfer effort and API that might be needed for this. In your commercial manufacturing, not only aim for producing cheaper, try also to work on a better process, better quality, better knowledge, better process understanding, because that will help you in your overall quality profile of your site. And also, if you make it less complicated in the beginning, that will be very helpful as well. And so, for instance, continuous coating, is that really needed from the beginning? You can also see that as a business case afterwards, and just leave space in your manufacturing area to add continuous coating afterwards as an additional step. But limit yourself first to the rest, so that you can learn easier and make it easier for your learning curve. Now, that's overall the things to be a little bit careful for. That doesn't mean that there is not so many benefits. The benefits are there, but just you need to assure that you have a good understanding of the assumptions before making your business case and before trying to grab those benefits of continuous manufacturing, so that you make the correct choices and maximize your profit with that. Now, globally, there's a lot of changes lately, and there's a number of things that have been evolving and that impact the way that continuous manufacturing can be implemented and can help. And what we realize is that there is quite some differences in impact and in type of implementation for different players in the world. For instance, a CDMO will look at continuous manufacturing or implement continuous manufacturing very different than a generic company or an innovator, and that will be different again for an over-the-counter manufacturer or a nutraceutical company. So many different ways to look at continuous manufacturing, but globally we see a number of changes. One is that the generic market is growing. We see, especially the last few years, a growth of the generic market in Japan. We also have seen that COVID-19 has had quite some impact on supply chain disruption of pharmaceutical products, and because of that, there is a tendency for onshoring in the US and Europe, which give opportunities for additional volume, and for additional fundings from the governments as well in these kind of projects. There's also an overall global increase of pressure on cost and on quality on not only pharmaceutical products, but also on OTC and on nutraceutical products. And the stronger need for quality and process understanding drive us in the arms automatically of more modern manufacturing techniques like continuous manufacturing. And there is also a global recognition that continuous manufacturing can really help in this, so that that we will be able to implement continuous manufacturing for a better understanding and for reshoring and for a better supply chain assurance globally. Now it's slightly different for the different types of companies, and every type of company has also their own set of problems and their own set of hurdles that they need to overcome. If we look at large innovators, for instance, they typically have a mix of existing products that they need to produce, and that are still patented, or maybe even are off patent. And in parallel, they produce a bunch of new products as well. So there's a mix of new product development and of the commercial manufacturing of legacy products. They also have a lot of development costs, only a limited amount, typically 1 or 2 products on 10 products that they develop are really making it to the commercial manufacturing. So all of those development costs, they need to be embedded in the commercial pricing or revenue that is being generated. And over time, the last few decades, the needed time for development is more and more. So it's very important that we are able to reduce the development time to some extent, to be able to keep revenue at a level that is acceptable for the shareholders in those companies. It's also very expensive to do development in the beginning, especially when API is being still developed in an innovator company. In the beginning of that process, API is very, very expensive and very scarce. So that's very often a limitation in that development process. That is, they have a very limited amount of material to work with, and have to try to develop with that very limited amount still an as robust as possible formulation. Now that doesn't always work, and for that reason, very often early in the process or in the development, the choice towards wet granulation needs to be taken, because that gives the most certain route to a formulation that works in a compression machine. But as I explained already, it is possible that with more API, or if there is more experiments possible, that it is more easy to overcome that and to drive the process towards a more easy direct compression process. Another difficulty that a large innovator has to deal with is the forecast, sales forecast. Very difficult sometimes, because if you have a new product that you're developing, to estimate how well it will sell before it's on the market, that's very difficult to estimate. So that means that if you are designing the capacity of an equipment, of a line, based on the forecast of one product that you will bring on there, very often, once that you get to the commercial state, your forecast was wrong, and you have either over or under capacity. So flexible equipment is very important, and the flexibility for several products and several total volumes are essential in an environment like this. Pipelines can be volatile. Many products come through, or it might not come through, and in the beginning, at a certain moment, you can think it's all direct compression, and 4 years later you might discover that actually half of the product now is wet granulation instead of direct compression. So these things change over time, and you need to assure that you have equipment that is flexible enough to handle that. Also, a mix of large volumes and small volumes. can be in the pipeline. And typically for large innovators is that they have an R&D department and a commercial department that is not very, very strongly connected. So often they work not really as silos, but there's still quite some walls between the R&D and commercial manufacturing organizations. And typically they operate as very different organizations that then transfer knowledge and work from one organization to the other, which makes it not always easy in a continuous manufacturing project, because that is typically something where R&D and commercial manufacturing need to be completely intertwined and working together from a very early stage. Now, in R&D, there's some different objectives compared to commercial manufacturing. So R&D needs flexibility. They want to be able to develop broadly. They want to assure a robust process. They have limited API to do that with. They have a volatile pipeline, unpredictable demand. They want to get speed to market for company profitability. And how continuous manufacturing can help there is by helping to generate a great quality profile, so help the process understanding. They also want to maximize PAT in there, so to maximize that knowledge. While on the other hand, for commercial manufacturing, the maximum PAT is giving a burden on commercial production, because it's more complicated and it will stop the line regularly if something is measured that should not be there. So the R&D development typically has a limited amount of API. So what is ideal there is that the development is done with API sparing techniques, so that continuous manufacturing is implemented in a way that API use for development is minimized. The work together with CDMOs often helps, because there's very often a mix of internal development and external development, and that might be helpful to make everything a lot more flexible. So if there is a CDMO that has similar equipment than this large innovator in their R&D department, that is very helpful for flexibility for R&D divisions of large innovators. Now, the supply chain part, they also have an unpredictable demand, but they also look very, very critically to their reputation. So they want to assure that there's never ever a recall. They want to assure that that there is sustainability achieved, and that they can publish numbers of sustainability, lower energy consumption, good for the environment, etc. So reputation is critical, and continuous manufacturing can help there, because there's lower energy consumption, lesser waste, etc. So that can help to achieve those sustainability goals. The process knowledge to reduce investigations and recalls and wasted batches, etc., will help there as well. And the maximizing profitability by using copy-paste equipment of a development organization will help then for less tech transfer costs. And even if there is an issue or an investigation, R&D will be able to help easily because of the models they have, the equipment they have there. They can do experiments on that line there. So everything is a lot easier to transfer one-on-one between R&D and commercial. Very helpful. Now, what is essential there is that the supply chain members, they team up with R&D from early beginning of this kind of project, because otherwise the R&D development will be done with complex, flexible equipment, but not so much in correspondence to the needs of the commercial manufacturing. Maybe too complicated for commercial manufacturing, etc. So it's important that there is a good alignment and a good negotiation between R&D and supply chain from the beginning, to assure that the objectives are combined, that they're both aiming for similar and the same objectives, and then do a split of potentially the cost and the benefits of an overall project that integrates the R&D benefits, tech transfer, and the commercial benefits. That would be the ideal. Now, smaller innovation companies, they typically do not have these kind of silos or walls between those two organizations. But they also have less reserves, so they can take less financial risks. They have a smaller portfolio, only limited amount of products, and limited resources to work with as well. Um, they have they have less experience overall, have filed less products, so less experience with regulatory filing. So they need to grow their capabilities in all different dimensions. So the best way to work for smaller innovator companies is to collaborate with vendors and with academics and with consultants to do initial trials and to do process development together, and then start with a smaller line, a flexible line for only a few products, copy paste it in commercial manufacturing, or even in some circumstances do development and commercial manufacturing on the same line, or make use of a CDMO to learn. So they can do their first product externally, learn from that CDMO, and like that minimize their risk of losing the equipment if a product fails, for instance. They have to reduce their risk also by investing smart, not as late as possible. Invest smart in people. Use the best choices for the technology. So not only the type of equipment and the type of process, but also which PAT, and flexible enough to assure that if a next products come by, that they can work with that as well. And they need to build the future, because it's never just about the equipment itself. It's also about the overall mindset in the organization, the quality thinking, the way that you look at investigations, at your products, the way that you look at data that you took for sampling, real-time release in the future, automation. All of that needs to be seen as an overall principle. And as a small innovator, you have the big advantage that you can still build new organizations or new parts of your systems. So prepare them already for a continuous manufacturing philosophy. And as an alternative to small investment, careful external use of CDMO, etc., you can also bet on time to market. So take a higher risk, that's possible, and then betting on being a lot earlier on the market with your new product than if you would develop it in batch. It's a higher risk indeed, but also a bigger return like that. CDMOs, they are slightly different. They need to be able to serve a vast, broad amount of companies. So they need to have flexibility from the start for a whole range of technologies, and they need to be able to switch between capacities and different technologies. So flexibility is absolutely key there. But also trust. So companies that are new in this, they will turn to a CDMO, ask them, can you do continuous manufacturing? And the CDMO needs to be able to show that they are very capable of handling continuous manufacturing processes. So they will need to have internally a lot of expertise, which means that before offering this to the market, they will need to learn very early, probably with internal products, how to deal with continuous manufacturing, and not start to learn only when a customer comes to them. And so trust and flexibility are key factors for CDMOs. We see that the estimation is that CDMOs will be wanted very strongly in the coming years, because CDMOs can be very, very helpful to bridge the period of uncertainty in bringing a product to the market and for innovators. So it's especially for the smaller innovators, CDMOs can be very, very helpful. And the companies that prefer not to take that big of an investment risk, also their CDMOs can be very useful, because the equipment is already there at the CDMO's site normally. Also, a company that has limited knowledge, limited resources, can use a CDMO for this help. Generics, slightly different. They have low margins, many products in portfolio. They have immediate competition. So when they come on the market with a product, there's immediately other generics also that will be on there with those products, because everybody works up front to try to find a generic way of production of the blockbusters that are on the market most of the time, and that are losing patent. So the product success is already established there, so that's not a question. But still, volumes will be volatile, because in some cases the volume goes to the competition, or they can win it, and that yes or no means an enormous difference in potential volumes. Generics chase also a big amount of different products at the same time, so the portfolio is very large. Now, recommendation would be there to focus not on all those products, but on a specific set of products or product groups that would be directed towards continuous manufacturing. So only a limited amount in the beginning, so that they would be able to play with batch and with continuous in the same time. Also, the conversion of a wet granulation product to a direct compression product would be very beneficial, because that makes a lot cheaper method of commercialization. And it is possible in continuous manufacturing. It's easier to develop a product in direct compression if you do that in a continuous manner. So there's a number of products that are difficult to bring from wet granulation to direct compression in batch, but but still is easier to do that in continuous manufacturing. So there are a number of products out there that have a good business case because of that. Also, the generics that think, well, continuous manufacturing, maybe not yet something for us. The investment is so high. Yeah, maybe the investment is relatively high, but it doesn't mean that you need to buy the most complicated or expensive equipment out there from the start. You can also start with relatively simple, relatively cheap continuous manufacturing equipment. Start with direct compression only in the beginning, and then expand later if you need to. And also realize that over time there will be a bunch of products that have been developed in a direct compression process and that will come off patent. So the generic companies that are then ready and have already grown that knowledge, they will have an enormous competitive advantage on the market versus the other generics that will be able to pick up that volume of those products. Because converting a product that has been developed in continuous and converting that batch back to batch, that's not so easy either. So in one direction, it's not so obvious, but in the other direction, not either. So that would be a good additional tool, which gives you a strong competitive advantage versus the other generics. Over-the-counter nutraceuticals, they are having more and more emphasis on quality. So they get more and more pressure of having similar quality profiles than pharmaceutical products or RX companies. They do have high competition as well. Margins sometimes low, sometimes big. It depends a little bit on the process and on the type of product, but the volumes always are unpredictable as well. There's quite some variation also there. So flexible batch sizes, flexible throughput can be very helpful there. Also there, I would say focus on specific products and product groups so that you do not go too broad, so that you do not need to have a very diverse and complex equipment, but that you can focus, for instance, on direct compression. And also there, if you can convert from wet granulation to direct compression, that will very often give a very nice business case. Typically, what we see also is that continuous manufacturing is used to solve specific quality issues, and that is very helpful as well. So if you do a conversion from a batch product with quality issues and bring that to a continuous process like that, you can solve the quality issues and you have your lower cost manufacturing way as well. In some cases, there is equipment that is getting older and older, and at a certain moment, it needs to be replaced. That's a great moment to implement the continuous manufacturing process, to replace obsolete equipment by new equipment in a continuous manufacturing manner. And in some cases, even a site consolidation can be done with continuous manufacturing. So there are business cases to be found. Now, if we look at the future, what does that mean? We see that there's many different indicators that show us that costs are going down of continuous manufacturing projects in general. Benefits are going up for multiple reasons, mainly because there's more and more knowledge that is being shared, which gives more API sparing techniques, etc. Which and also the maturity of the equipment goes up, which gives better yields, shorter cleaning and changeover times, etc. And also the risks are going down. So overall, the evolution of continuous manufacturing is being very, very positive. Now, as a conclusion, I think there's a few things to say. One is continuous manufacturing for pharmaceutical products. It's not coming, it's already there. So there's nearly all the big pharma companies, they are already working on it. There's quite a few products already on the market and approved by the FDA. But you have to realize that continuous manufacturing is not just buying a machine and putting it in an area in your facility. It's a complete way of thinking. It's a different mindset. So you need to think differently when you implement continuous manufacturing. And that's something that takes time as well. So transforming your organization together with bringing in the equipment is very important to understand. Continuous manufacturing can solve many of your problems. I think we covered many problems already, financial, quality, and many others that can be solved like that. But also understand that the learning curve takes quite some time. You cannot step in there and know it immediately and reap the benefits from the start. So you need to start early and you need to start well. So I think if you do not start early, in any case, your competitors certainly will. And with that, I would like to conclude my presentation. Any questions you can now send into the chat. Thank you very much. So the definition of batch in continuous manufacturing has been debated many times in the past, and in the meantime, it's very clear and it's all well described in the ICH Q13 in the meantime. So batch can be defined as well as a limited amount of material that you put in your line. It can be defined as a limited amount that comes out of your line, and it can be defined as an amount of time at a certain throughput that you run your line. For instance, a runtime of 20 hours at a throughput of 40 kilos per hour. So that also ends up in a fixed amount, and that's how you can define a batch. You can also define a batch range. You can say, for instance, my batch range that I will run will be between 20 kilos of output and 200 kilos of output. And that's very well possible. Now, the international guidelines for equipment design and system integration, there's no clear guidelines yet. ISPE has recently published a document that describes best practices for equipment design, high level, and they are working on a bit more detailed level for equipment design as well. There are some documents out there that describe best practices, but there's not yet an international guideline. And especially SUPAC, for instance, was an international guideline for equipment and for equivalence of equipment in the batch world. There is no specific guidelines in there or tips in there for continuous manufacturing equipment. So that's something that we hope for. That is that SUPAC will expand or will be updated in the past also to include continuous manufacturing equipment designs. How many products have been approved as to date using the PCM concept? I think we are around 20 now, so that's not so many, but there's quite a lot in the pipeline. And there is, well, of course, you have the approvals by the FDA, so in the US alone, but also there's a bunch of products that are approved, for instance, in Japan separately, or in different countries separately, and not yet by the FDA. Or so there's different approvals in different areas of the world, but overall it's not so many. I think overall we are at this moment around 20. Continuous manufacturing, I think, will never replace batch production. I think there will always be a number of products that will continue to be in batch, even if there is specific technology that is not ideal for continuous manufacturing. For instance, let's say gel caps, or bilayer tablets, or so there's always some technologies that are not integrated in continuous manufacturing yet, and there will always be, to some extent, the need for batch production, because for some reason this is a lot cheaper or a lot easier, and it's completely fine. I think compare it a bit with email. Since the electronic email is out in our civilization, it's nearly everywhere, but we still write Christmas cards by hand to our friends. So the written letter never completely disappeared, although that email has so many benefits and is so much easier than handwritten letters, but they still coexist. And I think in the future it will be similar with batch and continuous manufacturing as well.